We're pleased to welcome Bob Butler this morning to talk about cyber deterrence strategies. And I was looking for the right context in which to make an introduction of Bob. And what else have we got going on out there now? The context, I think, was we did a workshop a month ago posing the basic question in a national security strategy that says, we want to outcompete our adversaries. What does it mean to outcompete in cyberspace? This brought together 80 people around the table for a couple of days to scratch their heads over a question without a very good answer as yet. And one of the themes that emerged from the discussion was that in the community of people who are doing strategic thought about the new cyber problem, the sense of conventional wisdom in that group is that we're at something like 1955 or 1957 and beginning to think about the nuclear problem. That maybe we've thought our way 10% into this problem. That the strategic thought that's so far developed has been path-breaking, but has only launched just a little bit. And if you look at this in a competitive net assessment context, we're way behind. Two or three or four adversaries who've invested a lot of time and intellectual capital in thinking about the new landscape and the opportunities available to them and the vulnerabilities they have in cyberspace. And to do the necessary strategic thought requires that we create new communities of interest that break down all of the lovely barriers within our existing communities of interest. You have to have people who understand the science technology, people who understand military strategy, people who understand winning in circumstances short of overt armed confrontation, counterintelligence, law enforcement. I mean, the list goes on and on. What makes our speaker today unique is that he's been a leader in that first bit of strategic thought, in part because he's worked in so many of these different communities of interest. He brings a military background, an intelligence background, a corporate background, a government background. He is the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for cyber policy. We had the pleasure of serving together 10 years ago. And he's now in a consulting role by and large, where he's trying to stimulate more thinking in all of the communities of interest that are relevant to this problem. And he's going to talk this morning for about 45 minutes on the fundamentals of cyber strategy and pose some questions for us to think about, and then we'll turn to Q&A. The presentation itself is on the record and being videoed, but the Q&A will be off the record, the video will be off. So we'll take the conversation wherever you would like. Please join me in welcoming Bob Butler.
Appreciate it. Yeah, fantastic. Well, it's great to be here at the lab. Thanks for the invitation, Brad, to come out. The one thing I was not expecting was the temperature to be the same as Texas when I got here. I was expecting a little bit cooler climes. I will be speaking on the record, but from my personal vantage point, I'm not going to be representing the government or AECOM or any of the other affiliations I have here. And I'm going to try to give you some perspective of where we've been, where we are, and where I think we could go. And as Brad indicated, some challenges that I think we collectively should be able to kind of work on. So just by way of perspective, Brad alluded to some of this. I've had the opportunity to serve in the military for 26 years, in the Air Force, serving as an intelligence officer. I started academically in the world of math and quantitative business methods and programming. So worked back in the old days on BAL and PL1 and Fortran and C and different languages. And I think as we look at the world today, that actually put me in a situation where I was somewhat advantaged in thinking about where we were going with the world of information technology and technology writ large and the evolution. being involved in the intelligence community during the Cold War and then post-Cold War. And then since then, the experiences coming out of the military where we begin to see these crossovers in convergence, right, in digital and physical worlds, but also in the worlds of the roles that we take on, whether we're a postdoc, we're a scientist here, an engineer here, whether we're on boards or what have you. So what I'd like to do is kind of collectively talk about what those experiences have shown me over the last few years, and I'll pick it up by talking first from where I was and serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Space and Cyber Policy and kind of go forward from there. In those days, we saw that a risk was looming, it was increasing and accelerating. At the same time, we struggled with understanding what to do about it. We came up with the first defense cyber strategy. And then from that, we developed a command structure, which is a typical kind of military DoD response. The world has changed radically since then. It was actually changing underneath us. And so, again, my perspective here is we think about the world as it exists today or as it was, as opposed to thinking into the future. So let me get started here. I'll share my experiences in the business world as we go through this. I do serve currently as the Senior Vice President for Critical Infrastructure Protection Strategies for AECOM. AECOM actually is part of the lab environment here. And AECOM is a huge company that designs and builds lots of infrastructure around the world. And my job is to kind of review in both greenfield and brownfield space, how do you build resilience, right? How do you build resilience in these converging worlds? How do you build it and do it efficiently, and how do you do it and you build it for a life cycle? Okay, I'm going to start with the bottom line up front. So the world as we see it today, and I think many of you are aware of this and would agree, capabilities on the part of people that don't line up with our national interests is increasing in terms of their aggressiveness and proactiveness of working counter to our national interests. And specifically, based on the work that I'm focused on, it's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and what we're dealing with terrorism today. And in that space, we continue to hit inflection points, and we're struggling with what to do about it. In the area of cyber itself, we have struggled with thinking through, the kinds of steps that we should take as we react to events looking back in the rearview mirror, whether it's Chinese IP theft, Russian intrusions into other sovereign states, DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, or what have you. And so what we have found is what we're doing is not deterring anything. We need to do more. So let me take you through then a series of work that we've done in the Defense Science Board that has been published that kind of illuminates these points and drives then to these ideas. First off, we've been looking at the defensive aspects for some time, and back in 2012, 2013, we did realize as we looked at what adversaries were doing across the risk spectrum, right? A lot of times people look at one aspect of risk. Risk is a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence management, right? Many times we'll look at vulnerabilities and what we have to do to fix vulnerabilities, and we look at it strictly within the information technology space as opposed to the broader security risk. We're struggling with thinking ahead on advanced threats, and we very, very often don't think of all the consequences in terms of residual risk and how to build consequence management strategies. In the Defense Science Board work in 2012, 2013, there was a real strong assertion that none of our critical military systems were resilient, and that there was an existential threat to those systems. That led to a series of other studies coming down the road, one dealing with cyber deterrence, where we talked through what it meant to impose cost or to deny benefit, and we talked about other issues regarding how things were becoming intertangled. And so this idea of thinking through the glass house that we live in and the fact that we are dependent upon critical infrastructure that is outside the fence line. and the fact that that critical infrastructure, if it goes down, if there's a problem with it, actually creates real challenges for us. Let's fast forward then to the next study, which was really cyber as a strategic capability. And in that discussion, what we came away with were 5 big findings. And this was about a year and a half ago. The first of which was dealing with the fact that the strategy wasn't working. It was ineffective. It was stalled. Part of that was because of policy. Part of that was because of political will. The second thing that we came away with was, in order for an offense to be effective, we must have a good defense. And we have to focus our defense in certain areas. We have to focus on the high-end systems, because we can't protect everything, right? So we have to focus on the things that are most important. The third finding that came out of this study was people. The challenge in creating a workforce that can actually have the readiness and, more importantly, the proficiency level at both the individual level and team level to support what we need to do in this space, defensively and offensively. The fourth was, it's not just a team or a group of teams within the Department of Defense or the Department of Homeland Security or within a company. It's a whole of government or a whole of America approach. How do you work culturally across internal organizations? How do you work, say, in Washington across interagency? Below Washington, interagency activities within joint task forces on a border or wherever? How do you work with industry differently? Not just call it public-private partnerships, but what does that really mean? And then how do you work with allies, with international partners, to build like-minded strategies to solution, not just to share information, but to solution. And then the fifth area was policy. And the policies we had struggled. And policy normally lags behind concepts, operational concepts, but we were really lagging in this space. So as a result of that, I had been thinking, others had been thinking, and former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Frank Kramer, who Brad knows and many of you in the room might know, and I decided to put together a piece on what we should do about it. And that's the bulk of these ideas over here. So I just want to walk through this in terms of what these ideas are, what it means behind the bullets, and what we're doing about it today and how they can be operationalized, and then some ideas that the lab could take away. This is very true. This is the different environment we're involved with today. Some people call it gray zone, but we no longer have overmatched capabilities. I mean, that was part of the Cold War. That was part of what came out of the Cold War with the dividends of the Cold War, is we were overmatched certainly in conventional capabilities. We could actually do shock and awe, right? We are no longer overmatched in this level below armed conflict, and we have adversaries that have learned from what we've done how to build asymmetries in this space. Okay. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of a tutorial on active defense and what I mean by active defense. I wrote about this in 2010, 2011 with Deputy Secretary Bill Lynn. We were talking about active cyber defense. And back in those days, it was, we need to do more beyond the walls of a network. And what we were thinking through was we had highlighted a problem with an operation called Buckshot Yankee, where we saw an adversary get inside and, using removable devices, infected computer systems. And so the idea of looking beyond your networks, doing something about it ahead of time. We really never operationalized that, but we pushed forward with a new strategy in 2015, which was a good basis that built on 2011, but still lagging behind the realization of what we really needed to do with this risk. Big focus on deterrence, so the idea of creating resilience within the DoD and Defense Industrial Base networks, the idea of actually beginning to use offensive capability, and finally this idea of supporting the combatant commands in an integrated way. What we have found is that as we've moved forward in time and we've seen aggressive activities on the part of especially the Tier 5, Tier 6 adversaries, China and Russia, that has been ineffective. So we needed to address all of these things going forward, and active defense is one one way of approaching it. Coordinated partnerships of active defense. There's many techniques. You can see them up here. I'm happy to talk about them. That George Washington University collected and kind of put into a neat graphic. But the concept here was to really go further in terms of taking the fight to the enemy. And so we have a new strategy out in 2018 called Defend Forward, right? And it's actually supported. That's the defense strategy. There is also a national cyber strategy, which is aligned somewhat with this. And the thought with Defend Forward is you basically are in red space and you are actually working to support activity that helps you to take the fight to the enemy at the source of where malware might be created. As a result, you have a strategy that's now enabled in a very different way, a different way of thinking through policy. And with the political will that we currently have within this administration, we are changing policy. We are changing the way we do TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. This idea of persistent engagement is now the construct for how a cyber command moves forward. We are beginning to move in this area of leveraging whole of America. We're not there yet, but we're recognizing, and not just saying, but recognizing and working with allies and working with industry and working with interagency partners in different ways than we have in the past. And of course, as I mentioned previously, we are prioritizing efforts. One of the things that hit me hard when I became a chief security officer of a global data center company, and you are beginning to think about information and physical assets of clients that are spread all over the world. We had data centers in Singapore, we had data centers in New Jersey, we had data centers in Phoenix, Ohio, and in London. You can't do everything. So what are your most important information assets? What are your most important physical assets? And what kind of resources do you have to put against that problem? And then manage residual risk, right? Manage the rest of the enterprise. Okay, so let's now get into the details of what we're advocating and where we are. The first idea is we need to do more in critical infrastructure. And really, when I say critical infrastructure, I'm talking about lifeline infrastructure to support national security missions. Nuclear C2, integrated missile defense, force projection. There's a natural nexus with public safety in these communities as we work through these events. And there's a natural nexus with business enterprises. So it is the ones that I've listed up there, energy, not just the electric, but oil and natural gas. It is an intersection with nuclear. It's an intersection with water treatment. And a lot of other lifeline infrastructures. Not all of those 16 critical infrastructures should be covered in the same way. Based on, again, prioritizing resources, I think we need to think carefully about how we apply the resources that we have. There are models that we can work off of. The financial services, a couple of years ago, built a center called the Financial Systems and Analysis Resilience Center, FSARC. FSARC is an example of like-minded businesses coming together around a common infrastructure, namely the global transaction platform, right? So you have the 8 biggest banks in the New York City area getting together, working together, sharing information, sharing threat information, solutioning together in active defense. Incentivized because of a global transaction platform that they all rely on, but at the same time, also focused on helping others inside of a large risk register, right? So those banks are dependent upon Con Edison in New York City, right? So Con Edison becomes part of their extended enterprise look. So there are models that we can work off of. There's also concepts here that we need to think about that allow us, as Brad was indicating, you have to create collectives of cross-sector integration. So the defense industrial base has its own kind of information sharing approach. It has scaled and it is growing. It has some best practices that need to kind of cross over and support others, both in the extended defense industrial base supply chain, in the Department of Defense, and I think best practices could be shared between the financial services and DIB. But every one of these needs some help. Now the question comes up, can you do it all with, regulations, or how do you create incentives in this space? The financial services, they're fairly well off, right? So they are pretty well incented. There is a compliance regime with the SEC, FSA over in London, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and other regulatory authorities, but they're incented to work together. Defense industrial base, to a certain extent, because of an intertwined supply chain and the business, but it is competitive, and so there's more of a regulatory approach, as you see in the DFARS. We have to find a way to adjust authorities and resourcing in the federal government system to allow these critical infrastructures to connect together much faster, much better than they are today. The FSARC, again, is an example of where that's happening. I was involved in my AECOM hat with the Army Cyber Institute a couple of years ago. How many know the Army Cyber Institute? Anybody aware of them? Okay, so the Army Cyber Institute is a think tank-ish organization at West Point. And what they are working on are Army futures, right? They're trying to look at it from both an education perspective at West Point as the U.S. Military Academy, and they're trying to connect into a future where the Army force structure has to change to meet evolving mission sets. Part of it is homeland defense of what's going on in communities and cities. And it's not just a National Guard function in light of where we see an evolving threat, right? So in that space, one of the experiments that they were looking at was the idea of what should be the military's role in supporting communities as it relates to advanced threats. I participated with them and helped drive scenario development and execution of their second phase of their experimentation. First phase was in New York City, small exercise, small experiment, bring the emergency management team together. Let's talk about ways that we can build a much more effective integrated approach between the physical side and the cyber side of what's going on in New York City. And police department, fire department, all these folks came together. And small scale, but now has created some synergy to create their own version of a New York City Cyber Command. I was involved with the Houston setup. I'm from Texas. And Houston, of course, large port city, important port, not only from a commercial standpoint, but from a military standpoint. We have port activities, including up at Beaumont, where we do a lot of transload operations. And so in that space, we looked at ways that we could take a scenario of a natural disaster and then add the play of a nation-state actor into it. So here you know it's a deliberate event that you have warning on, and you begin to now work in that space as a nation-state actor might to actually create worse effects for the community and for military missions projecting force out. What came out of that was certainly some new playbooks and some new relationships, but it became very obvious that there's a significant challenge here when you start to work bottom up. When you're starting to work from an emergency operations center in Houston that, again, does great jobs with Super Bowls and World Series games and all kinds of other events, but when you put this kind of activity into the space, it really, really makes it very difficult. So we're connecting cities, EMS, critical infrastructure lifelines, county, state, Guard, FEMA, Coast Guard, FBI, other elements of the federal government together. And as a result of that, we realized that this bottom-up approach, the communities really understand what they need, but programmatically, they're struggling with the dollars to support this. So the recommendation here is we need to establish a way of creating some consistency on state support. Here in California, I mean, you've gone through a lot of natural disasters. I mean, fires and earthquakes and gas leaks and all kinds of issues here, right? Every time we get into one of these events, we learn from that event, and those lessons are very difficult to translate into other places. So the point here is let's leverage the expertise at a state level with our regional experts out of FEMA, begin to culturally draw the physical response and the cyber response folks together, raise the readiness levels of our Guard units to support this idea. National Cybersecurity Fusion Center. You're familiar with NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center. You're familiar with the National Counterproliferation Center. You're familiar with things that we've done at the federal level to bring different entities together. They work differently based on their operational missions. They have different players in this space. They're measured differently. We believe that in this world of cyber, especially as we look at the adversary really working across boundaries, that we need a better way of working command and control. A joint interagency task force-like structure where it's intel-driven, counter-intel-driven ops that allows you to take not always rapid action, but the right actions, and to be able to include a much larger swath of American talent. Controversial recommendation that Frank and I have written about is this concept of certified active defenders. So we have lots of entities, some here at Lawrence Livermore, some in other parts of the country, that are really, really gifted in terms of cyber defense. We do not have enough in government today. There are ways, there are precedents in terms of being able to look at those individuals. We see it in the Guard all the time as we flip between a Title 32 and a Title 10 activity. Can we create and employ statutes that allow us, and then train to, using certified active defenders from labs, private sector, and other places as a way of doing this? Now, all of these activities you can see on the last bullet all require some realignment. I'm going to talk about realignment on the federal budget in terms of not just the budget, but authority structure as well. Finally, this is something I've written about in a couple of different ways. This is the idea of like-minded nations, right? This is the fourth eye, the international piece. How do we get allies involved in helping us promote the right standards as we watch adversaries involved in looking at internet protocols and where we're going with internet protocols over time? How do we get allies involved with looking at cross-border critical infrastructure? Let's go back to the SWIFT attack on the bank in Bangladesh just a few years ago. How do we work to do active defense campaign planning together as like-minded nations? That's the construct behind the International Cyber Stability Board. Enabling that are a few other things that allow us to go from whole of government, whole of America, to something broader. So let me go ahead now and just talk a little bit quickly about the federal government piece. There are different things that have to happen here based on what we're describing. We are changing some of the authorities and policies already from the Department of Defense perspective. So some of the foundational things that you'd want in a National Cybersecurity Fusion Center are already beginning to gel a bit. We do need to do more work with the Congress and the executive branch on support to state and local authorities. We'll certainly need authorities for certified active defenders. And you know, as we think about new organizations that are standing up, how do you ensure their readiness, right? I mean, it's not just organic government folks ready. How do you ensure the readiness of that reserve force that you might have? Importantly here is building off of concepts that we've already got some traction on. So a few years ago, in NATO's military committee and defense planning committees came up with this idea of framework nations, more capable NATO allies helping less capable allies, especially in enabling functions like logistics and support. One of the arguments that we have made is let's use a similar concept with NATO in extended cyber deterrence. So this is working with NATO allies to help them harden their military networks, help them harden entities that they're dependent upon with regards to doing their military missions and working hand in glove. This could be an extension of the state partnership program where we have Guard units already going over to countries, to allied countries. It could be take on a frame in a lot of different ways, but we're already starting to build on this as we go forward through the Department of Defense activities. Resources are interesting because in the resource area, it's not just setting up these centers, but it's really bringing more people into this space. So part of it is the certified active defenders. Part of it is also looking at training, creating training programs that allow people to move quickly to higher level skill sets. It's cross-flowing people differently from government to industry and then back. So that's another item that we talk about within the article. And the final effort is something hopefully near and dear to you, is we have got to do better at looking at R&D, right? I would say we do real good at fundamental research and basic research, but when we start to move across the test readiness levels, and I want to get to applied R&D and get something out the door, finding ways to invest dollars that allow us to do DevOps. Because we're in a situation where we're not only converged, but we're in constant contact with our adversary. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is now shifting gears, again, more to the technical architecture aspects. I want to give credit to the Defense Science Board. I'll mention some of their recommendations. U.S. CERT, Johns Hopkins University. Some of this was presented at RSA this past year by the Johns Hopkins team and Carnegie Mellon. But these are some ideas for helping to build a more resilient architecture. We talk a lot about networks being breached and that they're going to be permanently breached, but we're slow to pick up on how to address the problem. We need to find ways to think about authenticating in roles and in responsibilities across devices and people, and we need to continually update a risk register. We need to think about the value of inefficiencies together with resiliency. Continue to see problems where we're exposing ourselves because of poor vulnerability management practices. Part of this is the fact that we're just not thinking about correlating log information. I just recently saw where we trying to find an insider problem and we're not correlating Active Directory and DNS logs. I mean, so challenges in this space abound, but we've got to get started with actually moving in a direction where we presume breach will always have breach, and what can we do with different kinds of adaptive resilience strategies. So it's not just a honeypot, it's not just segmentation, but it includes, pushing back in active defense. It includes redundancy as a strategy. It includes hiding in plain sight as a strategy. It includes a lot of different things. So we're working on this in the Department of Defense. We're moving in the enterprise. We're actually challenging extended enterprise partners to move in that direction, and I think that's where we need to go. And there's a lot of good vendor work going on in this space. We just need to integrate it and realize that with the plethora of data that's coming in, there's opportunities here to do things differently, and the technology is changing in such a way that we now can do zero trust. One of the things that really has frustrated me over the years is we typically see a problem, we look at the problem, we come up with a solution, we might go to a DARPA or some other agency to prototype a solution, and then it takes forever to get it out into the commercial world, and then they get picked up by the US government base. We saw that with WikiLeaks. There was a technology solution that was available 10 years prior. We saw some things, I've seen some things now with an acquisition of some endpoint software that we knew we needed 6 years ago, still waiting for it, right? We have got to get into a DevOps environment in this space, in zero trust. Extended enterprise, supply chain. These are Defense Science Board recommendations, but the idea, and I just picked two of them, right? We can talk about a lot of different strategies here. One is in the area of hardware. You know that most of our microelectronics is now offshored. What do we do? I think we need to relook at the problem from the standpoint on the hardware of not maybe creating a US government foundry, but looking at commercial foundries here in the country and thinking through how that could be done, how that could be protected, how do we move forward with that. The other is in the area of software assurance. As you read in DOE IG reports, as you read in GAO reports, we continue to struggle with validation of what we're doing to fix problems. So creating an entity with some of the best formal methods to help us look at the issue of software assurance. And again, I'm privileged to help sit on the technical advisory group at Carnegie Mellon's Software Engineering Institute. And there's some great work there. There's some great work, I'm sure, going on here. Great work going on around the nation. But finding a way to take those methodologies and rapidly put them into a process that allows us to really have high levels of assurance in extended supply chain. And then the third area really, and again, we've talked again a lot about this, but now I see it happening more and more. We need to take even some of the basic machine learning, the basic Bayesian theorem, a priori logic schemes that we currently are doing by human task within a security operations center, and we need to automate them. We need to find a better way of taking a sysadmin and making him more productive or her more productive on higher level tasks. And so there's work that I see going on with Splunk and UiPath and some of the other vendors looking at data lakes differently that we are starting to look at. It doesn't always have to be reviewing NetFlow logs. We can do things differently. So those are some of the areas that we think about on the technical architecture. I'm just going to throw out one more concept and then I'll wrap it up with a challenge. And that's this idea of continuous net assessment. So let me set some foundation on continuous net assessment. Brad alluded to some of the work in the past and when we started serving together back in 2009 timeframe. Well, looking back when I was in uniform, prior to the turn of the century, I mean, we see things that happen. We were fighting a Cold War. We actually were able to successfully draw that to a close. Meantime, our adversaries were put into a situation where it was extremely difficult for them because a lot of the establishment, the bureaucracy, either didn't anticipate all the effects or there was a kind of an alternative within the country looking at a different way other than how it turned out publicly for these outcomes to change, right? So what I mean here is, like in the case of China, after Tiananmen Square, and I did get a chance to go to China 96, 97 timeframe. We were trying to open up a strategy with the Chinese on air traffic safety. Challenging times, right? And if you read what the Chinese were writing out of the Academy of Military Science and reading what was coming out of a lot of their, both their military institutions, academic institutions, they were taken aback by some of the things that we were doing, that they could see. Certainly Desert Shield, Desert Storm, there's a lot of Chinese writings on that. This concept of shock and awe and the fact that they could not necessarily match what the United States was doing. A lot of thinking then that goes into asymmetrical strategies, right? On the Russian side, just one example, I happened to be in the Pentagon when the Russians introduced into the UN General Assembly in '98 this idea of a cyber arms control proposal. And then spent that year and years afterwards working with like-minded and other non-like-minded nations to try to build norms. As I think back on that, that was an attempt to slow down what we were doing in the United States. It was an attempt to help give us pause so that the Russians could kind of think through what they want. They saw what we did in Shield Storm. They saw what we did in Allied Force. So that's a snapshot, over the last decade or so in the last century. Now let's fast forward and look from 2019 back to 2000, 2001. And what I see is that as we're doing these things, the Chinese are actually now taking thoughts and putting them into action, into capability development, into deploying capabilities and pushing in their own regard. I saw this when I served as the Transcom Director of Intelligence during OEF and OIF. I saw this continue to evolve in the different jobs that I had in uniform and out of uniform. And it doesn't stop, right? Because of the drive of the Chinese leadership, and I'll go back to Jiang Zemin and we can go fast forward up to President Xi, there is this idea of continuing to grow in non-traditional ways, to meet the goals of what their nation espouses, right? And so in this space, you have things like the Belt and Road Initiative taking on a new life. And we're surprised, right? We need to think through that differently. And it's not just about economics. There is a digital path behind this as well. And it's really heavily dependent upon the digital path. But what are we doing in that space, right? The other is what we're seeing with not just Russian activity that's happened in the past, but how they're reflecting what they see us doing. I mean, the Gerasimov doctrine is more about the Russians' observation of the U.S. than what the Russians say they're going to do. So we need to think through this, and what this causes me to reflect upon is we have to have a different way of thinking through strategic net assessment, or in tactical sense, BDA, bomb damage assessment, to this concept of continuous net assessment that goes across multiple countries, the 4 countries I've mentioned and others, but includes counterforce targets and counter-value targets, right? It's a hard problem. It throws our intelligence collection system upside down, right? It changes the way we work with partners. So that is a challenge that I would ask all of us to think about. And if you have ideas on how to pull forward on that in a smart way, I'd be very open to talking with anyone about it. But the bottom line for me is we really need to move from this space of where we've been to continue to drive this forward, right? We are in constant contact, persistent engagement. We are not deterring activity to protect national interests. I think risk is increasing, our exposure is increasing. We need to do more. And there are ways to do more in architectures, in partnerships, in thinking of unity of effort, and this concept of how to manage risk. The idea of thinking about not just saying that, okay, I'm going to deploy this technology, and this technology is going to give me this advantage today, tomorrow, and next year. No, it doesn't work that way. That technology could give us relative advantage today, but we no longer can count on enduring advantage over years of time. We have to think through, in a gray zone, below the level of what DoD calls phase 3 conflict, how an adversary and how others in this space begin to work against it or with that technology or with that tactic and technique and procedure to create advantage for themselves. So on one side, it's understanding more about how long do I have advantage and what does that advantage look like. On another side, it's looking at how technologies, for instance, can be exploited against us. And what are the indications and warning that we're now moving into a different period of time of risk. Final slide and challenge. I'll go back to my friend Jim Gosler. Jim co-chairs many of the, chairs many of the cyber panels within the Defense Science Board. I got to know Jim when he was head of the Clandestine Information Technology Office a couple of decades ago. Jim talks about the idea of not only information assurance, and many of you that are in the world of cyber and information technology understand the characteristics of availability, confidentiality, and integrity. I'll tell you, I'm most concerned that because we haven't paid enough attention here, we're in a situation where integrity, and you see it with GAN and deepfakes, are real issues. We have created situations where, because we weren't paying attention to the integration, the balance across these 3 attributes, that we've so focused on preventing DDoS or preventing problems with somebody trying to steal something by going into complex strategies and multi-factor authentication, that we're forgetting about data integrity. But an adversary doesn't, right? And so there are things that are inherent within the capabilities that are deployed, but there are things that adversaries introduce. And so as adversaries take advantage of this more and more, what can we do to get asymmetries on our side? Are there things here at the lab? Are there things that could be here at this lab that could help us in this space? So that was about 45 minutes. I'll stop there.
That was excellent.
Okay.